Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I am Giulia Bottaro and I'm joined today by Felicia Jackson because our other co-host Heather Dinwoody is on holiday. Today we have loads to talk about, lot to unpack specifically about what's going on with the Science Based Targets Initiative, shortened with SBTi. Well, maybe we can start off by explaining, Fee, what it is for our listeners that maybe have heard the name, feel it's familiar, but don't know what it's about.
Sure. And also, this is the big scandal in the sustainability world at the moment, the big scandal in the carbon markets. Everybody's talking about it. But obviously, it's really important to understand what it is. So the SBTi is effectively the de facto science-based standard for net zero. We can talk about that later, but the idea is that companies go to the SBTi to get their net zero plans validated. And at the latest count, it's 4,500 companies have got science-based climate action plans that have been accredited by the SBTi. There's another nearly 3,000 that have got commitments that are awaiting validation. What's really interesting about this is historically, the SBTi targets are for net zero, but what they've always demanded is a credible climate transition plan, operational emissions reductions. That really has to be the core of the way a company moves towards net zero. They always said it's been since 2021, which is basically when they published their net zero standard, only 5 to 10% of overall emissions could be offset. So what that means is that the criticisms of the carbon markets used to be that companies would just go, oh, well, I'll buy offsets and keep carrying on business as usual. What the SBTi did say, no, we've got to do it in line with the science. We've got to do it in line with the Paris Agreement. Only the very hardest to abate emissions can be offset. So 5 to 10% maximum, which means basically 95% of what a company is doing to cut its emissions should be happening operationally. That means internally, it means scope 1 and scope 2, and it also meant scope 3. So throughout the supply chain. Now, there are lots of complications around scope 3 emissions. You may have been reading or listening to discussions about pushback in the States, about the complexity and cost of cutting emissions within the supply chain. And then this happened. Now, Giulia, I know you want to talk about the meeting. Oh, sorry, just to explain, the context of this is that the SBTi came out last week with an announcement saying that scope 3 emissions could now be dealt with by using carbon offsets. Then, of course, there was a letter published because the staff pushed back and they said, this goes against everything the SBTi stands for. You know, we can't do this. And they actually called on the board to resign. So this all stemmed from a meeting last month, which, Giulia, I know you're going to talk us through.
Yes, with pleasure. So in March, in London, there was a meeting with the biggest names of the carbon markets, and there were some representatives of the SBTi. And Bloomberg reports that these people were basically grilled with questions asking how can the SBTi allow for offsets, essentially. And one thing to bear in mind here, it feels like there is a little bit of conflict of interest because these meetings were hosted by the Bezos Earth Fund, which is the philanthropic project of Bezos, the former boss and founder of Amazon. So in all of this, let's bear in mind that Amazon was removed last year from the SBTi's dashboard of participating companies because it didn't submit revised climate targets. Amazon, in response, said that SBTi had changed its methodology in a way that made it difficult for the company to submit in a meaningful and accurate way. So the Bezos Earth Fund is also one of the core funders of the SBTi alongside IKEA. So on the one side, we've got this philanthropic initiative pushing for the development of the carbon markets, and on the other hand, it's also funding the SBTi, which is potentially, gatekeeping the carbon markets, because it's saying that companies shouldn't really use the offsets at their leisure. And so, we had this meeting last month, and then just a month after, the SBTi does a complete turnaround and said, okay, now, we can just use offsets for emissions. I mean, I'm going to play devil's advocate here just to say that it's not a made decision.
Oh, can I interrupt though and say that it was only after the backlash that the SBTi came out and said, by the way, there's been no change. We're going to publish a paper about it in July.
That's true. But, at the same time, it wasn't a done deal anyway. Like they had rules or anything. It was just a sort of statement of intent, which of course sounds like, yes, they were going to do it. It's not active as of yet. So if you are a company wanting to work with SBTi or, wanting to validate your targets, you still have to respect the rules as they were. Another suspicious thing, according to the FT, is that this decision happened in the middle of a study of companies' use of environmental credits. So the technical team of the SBTi was reviewing submissions after an open consultation. And so some of the staff members have told the FT that the board's announcement has blatantly violated internal protocol, because they basically went over the technical team's work to just say, okay, I'm going to do this, which to me doesn't scream science-based.
Well, I think what's really interesting here is that we're talking about a total lack of transparency and a total lack of governance in a body that is supposed to keep corporates, to hold corporates to account. And I think there is a real transparency issue with the SBTi. I think the idea behind saying that carbon credits can be used, and to be fair, it's not just carbon offsets, it's all sorts of environmental credits, and they've been allowed for scope 1 and for scope 2 in the past, power purchase agreements or renewable energy purchase agreements. I think the issue here is the connection between pressure from industry and major funding bodies and a sudden change in direction. The problem we have here is that the SBTi has got a bit of a history of being less than transparent. There's been peer-reviewed journal articles talking about, the lack of clarity around disclosure of inputs. So it's very difficult to use or to see clarity around public understanding or comparability between different companies. And there's actually what Bilbao, who was one of the originators of the SBTi and a member of its technical advisory group, he basically pointed out that this is the SBTi demonstrating low integrity at the leadership level as a pattern. And he's been sort of locking horns with the SBTi for a good few years because prior to 2018, the SBTi basically gave guidance on all science-based target setting methods to then banning any method except its own. And apparently, I'll add a link in the show notes to the documentation, but he filed a formal complaint about this in 2021. And in August 2023, the SBTi initiated processing of this formal complaint. Now, I know we had the pandemic, but that's quite a long time. And then apparently they said they'd refer the complaint to an independent committee and then said that would include an SBTi representative, which surely is the opposite of independent. And so there's real arguments and issues about the approach the SBTi is taking. And I think this was a really massive misstep by the organisation, because these conversations have been floating around and taking place within those really interested in the details of the carbon markets, the voluntary carbon markets. But this has really brought the whole conversation to another level. A lot of people are now getting involved. There's an ongoing conversation about the SBTi's approach on how they measure emissions reduction. So, I mentioned earlier this idea that, you have to have a credible decarbonisation plan dealing with your internal emissions, and that you can only offset to 5 to 10% of all those emissions. The issue being that these are absolute emissions reductions. So that works for a multinational whose market share probably doesn't change by more than 1% a year. So any real increase that you have in, well, actually, you're not really going to have that much of an increase in the market. As you improve your efficiency, you will see your absolute emissions go down. What that doesn't deal with is startups, those companies that perhaps are growing rapidly in order to displace high carbon intensive industries, yet they can't get approval for their plans because they can't do absolute emissions reductions at the same level. The weird thing about this, and this to me is the thing about industry pressure, there is flexibility, but only for larger companies. So SMEs, and that would include startups when they're starting, they're only allowed to use absolute contraction. But actually, if you're going to have innovations, if you're going to have green technologies, if you're going to have companies that are going to grow rapidly, you're going to have to look at intensity. There was a thing where Intel decided that it wouldn't submit its carbon plan to the SBTi because it said the absolute contraction approach isn't fair to companies that have been doing things already. So it puts early leaders at a disadvantage. So I think there are, I'm not going to argue that there aren't problems with the emissions intensity approach, because there are. You just have to look at the difference between nation state approaches and, the European Union cutting absolute emissions and China cutting emissions intensity. But that's what happens when you've got things converging, when you've got them changing over time. You need that flexibility. I mean, obviously, the oil and gas industry likes to use emissions intensity, which means it's not one of my favorites. But you have to think about handprint, which is what Intel was talking about, because that's what really covers this issue about whether a startup is taking market share from an intensely negative company. It's this idea. There needs to be a new approach, a methodological approach that allows you to consider the positive emissions benefits that those products can actually deliver. If that handprint means that by growing your own business, you're overall cutting emissions in the world, that's got to be a positive move forward.
I think another thing that we haven't really mentioned in the discussion so far is that Scope 3 emissions, which are the ones that account for entire supply chain, they're being generated by the entire supply chain and are the ones that the SBTi says we can buy credits for. They are the vast majority of a company's footprint. They can be, 80%, 90%, 95%. A company like Amazon, if we think about it, it's probably above 95%. And so, it's all well and good to have a company use renewable energy, but then if they're not striving to decarbonize their supply chain, then using the renewable energy is never going to be enough to provide a real decarbonization outcome. And so this is why it's so disappointing that the SBTi said this, because to me feels like, well, you can just give up on your decarbonization plan because we can just offset everything. And considering that Scope 3 emissions are the sheer bulk of emissions, then it just, to me just feels like, you can just try, but don't try too hard. It's fine. There are shortcuts.
I think that there is something else, though, that's really challenging for me, because while I think companies should be pushed to cut their emissions before offsetting, there is a real benefit to the purchase of carbon offsets, which is a flow of finance to projects which might not otherwise get funded in countries that really need that money, be that for protecting forests or indigenous peoples, be that implementing different approaches to energy consumption, whatever it might be. So I think there is an issue that's worth considering about the important role of carbon credits and carbon offsetting. The problem here is that this has just been done in such a messy fashion. It's making something really confusing to a lot of people even more confusing. And I think one of the things that's also worth exploring is whether or not there should be some kind of conversation about insetting. Because with the SBTi offsetting discussion, one of the things they're talking about is pulling for high integrity credits. So that's what the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets, the ICVCM, and the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, the VCMI, are all about. They're set up to help ensure that carbon credits are robust, that they're high integrity. And what that means is that they genuinely contribute to the reduction of GHG emissions, that they help mitigate climate change. That means, rigorous project selection, ongoing monitoring, and the strict enforcement of standards. There was so much scandal last year around research showing that a lot of carbon credits did not actually result in direct impact. So we need to have really credible projects with really credible carbon offset credits.
I'm going to bring up very briefly a recent example here to show the challenges of these projects. Brewdog, the brewer from Scotland, they've got loads of money. They invested loads of money in a regeneration project to plant birch and Scottish pines. And as of the most recent article, around 90% of them are dead. So sometimes it's not even just about the money. Sometimes, who knows? It's nature. Nature decided there are problems with these things that arise. Some of them go on fire with wildfires. Some of them are flooded. Like there's so much, just rely on these projects.
There's complexity.
There's so much complexity.
Yeah. And it's these two issues, and the real credibility, hangs on two things, and that's additionality and leakage. So whether or not, there's reduced impact, whether or not there's misallocation of resources, whether or not these things are credible, these things are hugely important, but that you have to pull out these different elements. There's the governance and transparency. There's the potential weakening of a demand for action on corporates by allowing offsetting for scope 3. There's how you define credibility and how you monitor these things. And there's also, there's real issues around the potential for greenwash, because the SBTi has also been accused of being allowing companies to take advantage of the process. I mean, obviously, I would never say anything like that. But earlier this year, the SBTi dropped quite a few companies off its list, off its commitment register, because companies can basically say, oh, they're going for an SBTi net zero target, whoop, whoop. And they've got 18 months to 2 years to put it in place. And then when they can't do it, or decide it's too expensive, or decide they don't want to, they can just pull out. So they've got
But
2 years.
They got all the good press. Yeah, exactly.
Now, I'm not blaming SBTi for that. That's part and parcel of this whole process. But the reality that underpins all of this is there isn't enough clarity. There isn't enough transparency. The SBTi should never have gone over the heads of the staff. They're supposed to be independent. They turned themselves into a charity earlier this year to try and shore up the idea that they're independent. This is not doing them any favours.
No, I'm just putting myself in the shoes of a manager at a company making decisions. This is so confusing. For maybe this person for years thought the SBTi was a reputable source, and now this scandal is really rocking.
We're not saying it's not reputable. We're just saying it's got some challenges right now.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say now its reputation is really on the rocks. And ultimately, we need someone to believe in. We need someone to tell us what to do, because everyone is confused. Time is running out. this is not only doing it, and
Okay,
if
I've got an idea for what we should
yes,
do.
what?
So insetting. No, seriously, insetting. It's like offsetting, but you do it
Yeah, I'm
internally.
sorry, that
So
doesn't.
if you're buying a,
Sorry, all the issues around
I know it's
transparency.
not what you're talking
No, but
about.
internally it creates a can of worms of transparency of.
No, but that's the, but if you what it's about, you can do it in the same way. You can have verification in the same way. All I mean is that it's about a company saying, right, I am going to directly put money and work into external, so supply chain related challenges, in order to improve the supply chain, in order to improve the things that matter to my business. So if you're a food and drink company and you need lots of a certain crop, you invest in regenerative agriculture or you support agroforestry to sort of improve soil quality and sequester carbon. I know that what you're talking about is we want someone to believe in, we want someone we can turn to say, this is valuable, this is good, we trust it. The problem we have is this is a market that's changing all the time. It's really complicated. Everyone seems to disagree with each other about the right way to do things. I think you're right that transparency is the most important thing. But I'm just thinking, going beyond the value chain, which is what Gold Standard talks about, is a really positive move in the right direction. So not just maybe have this thing of saying only 5 to 10% of offsets can come from the voluntary carbon markets as they are today, as in those projects developed in developing countries, maybe under the Paris Agreement, put everything in the voluntary carbon markets for that under an actually properly governed process. And then if you're going to do more, you do insetting. So you're actually putting money into your own value chain, and that can count. So that's not direct changes in your operational practice, but it's fundamentally changing your supply chain. So maybe we could
This sounds really valid. And of course, one final reminder, the remaining 90% is actual operational decarbonization, actual cutting of emissions, because let's remember, there are no shortcuts. Every company needs to. And it feels like we've done an SBTi special, but I think the occasion deserved it. So we can now swiftly move to the following two stories that we've got for you today.
Okay. The second story this week is actually, funnily enough, it's about carbon again. Sorry, guys. But actually, it's the fact that the European Parliament has actually voted to approve a deal on carbon removal certification. Now, with the SBTi, we were talking about the issues around offsetting and insetting and operational reductions. The fundamental reality is we are falling behind in emissions reduction. The climate seems to be reacting in unexpected ways. Extreme weather is accelerating. Climate scientists are talking about the fact that they're seeing changes in the climate far more rapidly than anticipated. The reality is there's going to have to be carbon removals. I'm not even going to get into the question about geoengineering, but we are not on track for the Paris Agreement. That means carbon removals have got to be taken seriously. And one of the problems, as we obviously know from the SBTi discussion, you've got to have certification. You've got to have clarity. So what the EU has done is basically vote in a voluntary, because it's still voluntary, carbon certification framework. The idea being that it will actually allow those buyers of those credits to understand what's going on. And it's a challenge. That there's technical carbon removal and there's nature-based carbon removal. These are really technical is quite easy to track, but incredibly expensive and hard to scale. Nature-based is incredibly positive in many, many ways. But again, it has these issues around permanence. So you've got afforestation or reforestation. So if you're going to plant new forests, you've got soil carbon sequestration. So that's agricultural practices. You've got biochar, which basically means you're creating charcoal and burying it. You've got bioenergy with carbon capture. and we'll get to carbon capture in a minute, enhanced mineralization, which literally means you crush rocks, you put them over a bunch of land, and they absorb carbon dioxide from the air. And apparently that lasts like 1,000 years or something, but it's rocks. And then, of course, the one that's in the news all the time, direct air capture. And that's basically machines that suck carbon dioxide straight out of the atmosphere. Now, I mean, it takes up a lot of land, still very expensive, very exciting technology. Where it all comes to be quite problematic is even with direct air capture, you've got that CO2 that you've sucked out of the air, you've got to bury it. You've got to store it somewhere. And I think what that's talking about is the fact that carbon capture is going to become central to any chance we have of achieving net zero. The difficulty we've got is that I think so far to date we've actually managed to, and this is in terms of capacity for storage, less than, no, I think it's just over 0.1% of the annual energy and industry related CO2 emissions. That's because it's 37 billion tons a year is what we're doing at the moment. So there are real challenges around where this CO2 is going to be stored. There's challenges around how you're going to get the CO2 to where these storage sites are. So it could be shipping, which is really bad for GHGs, or big pipeline networks. So I think what the EU is trying to do is recognize that, 2050 net zero is going to be difficult without removals, but trying to keep it distinct from the necessary act of cutting emissions today. What they really want and what they're trying to do with this certification framework is develop monitoring, reporting, and verification so that we actually understand what's going on with carbon removals. I mean, obviously, we're going to need a lot of different approaches. I haven't even mentioned ocean-based sequestration, but I can go on this sort of stuff for hours. But where it's really exciting is the potential for integrating carbon removals into emissions trading schemes. The EU's talking about doing it by 2026. The UK is already talking about it. And what it does, if it works, it gets rid of two particular problems that offsets have. What it does is we know it's additional because it's removing CO2 from the air, and it's permanent because you've stored it. I mean, obviously, as long as the storage works permanently, that's another discussion. But I'm just trying to say, what they're trying to do is establish a registry to clarify how it's been removed, how it's being monitored. And, to be honest, it really could be a key enabler of emissions reduction overall.
Okay, this sounds quite exciting. No, I'm not an expert in carbon as much as you are. All I can say is I hope this legislation is very comprehensive, there are no loopholes, and it works really well.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest, that's not necessarily the way regulation and legislation work in the first place, but we can always, keep our fingers crossed. I think one of the things...
It sounds like a first step.
It is a really important
like a positive
step. And, we know what we need to do. They're distinct approaches. If you're going to use them as a country for your own reduction targets, or if you're going to use them as a company, keep track of them separately. How about having separate targets for emissions reductions and emissions removals? Why not? In a nationally determined
contribution. That's a nice idea.
I don't think that's that difficult. I don't know.
Okay, well, I did say we would cover these two stories quickly, so we can now...
Take too long.
I know, you know what? It's our fault for picking this story because it's as complicated, if not more, than the SBTi.
But it's exciting.
But it's very exciting. So we can finish off with my story, which is something we can all relate with. It's human feces. They will be... a company in the UK called Firefly has reached an agreement with a low-cost airline operating across Europe called Wizz Air to provide sustainable aviation fuel made of human waste. So this company is planning to build a plant in the south of England, and will deliver fuel by 2028. And then Wizz Air is basically buying over 500,000 tons over 15 years. So this sort of, gives it the confidence to kick off with operations. This comes amid, Wizz Air's own goal to use sustainable aviation fuel for 10% of its flights by 2030. And similarly, the UK government has introduced a revenue certainty mechanism to support SAF production in the UK, so that at least 10% of airline fuel is made from sustainable feedstocks. So this is, exciting. I know that, Fee, you have something to say about SAF, so I'm going to leave the floor to you.
I am not the world's biggest fan of sustainable aviation fuel, mostly because it feels like an excuse to carry on with business as usual. You hear a lot about airlines which are doing amazingly exciting things with sustainable aviation fuel, but in the end, they still have to be burnt in an aeroplane. They emit the same amount of CO2 as kerosene as a general rule. Obviously, one of the reasons that airlines like it is that they're often biofuels based. So because CO2 is taken out of the atmosphere as the plants grow, you can actually claim that amount of carbon absorbed as a carbon saving. Where I think it's very challenging is scale. The airline industry is responsible for roughly 2 to 3% of all global CO2 emissions. That's actually more than some countries produce. And it's expected to grow really, really rapidly. There's huge issues around how SAFs are made. There's a risk of environmental harm. There's high costs. And there's a very limited supply. So I think in 2022, it was 0.1% was how much SAF contributed to aviation fuel being used generally. What I will say on this story, and I have to admit, it was an unexpected position for me to take. So when Giulia told me about this, I poo-pooed the whole idea and went off on a big discussion about sustainable aviation fuels. So,
no, but that's important to mention, of course.
It is. There's two types. You've got your liquid biofuel, which is what I was talking about with crops, and obviously food waste and algae are sources, and synthetic options, which are things like green hydrogen or synthetic kerosene. But I actually had a look at the website, and the idea that you might be able to use sewage. Again, I'm not sure how this is going to scale, but I think it's a really interesting approach.
I mean, there's no shortage of sewage anywhere in the world.
So, when you're talking about scale, access to that, I'm not quite sure how it's going to work, but I think there's some really interesting potential there. Where I probably get my negativity about SAF is listening to airlines which do a great deal of damage, because it's not just, airline fuel, it's contrails, it's all sorts of different things. It's the encouragement of just in time and fast fashion being flown around the world. It's this idea that airlines, which are pretty much not really doing anything to change their impact, except argue with those who want them to, get the opportunity to say, no, we're doing something amazing. Sustainable aviation fuel is the future. Yes, we've agreed to buy a tiny percentage of what fuel we're going to use, and they get a great PR campaign out of it. But I got to admit, if it does mean that, future buyers are locking in contracts, that's exactly the way the carbon removals market is getting off the ground. It's one of those ones where I'm going to have to swallow my own words and go, I need to learn more about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this story, the circularity of it is really appealing because, I see the issue with SAF for example, you're growing plants in order for them to be turned in sustainable aviation fuel instead of feeding these plants to people, which should be the number one priority. But ultimately, yes, we do need to rethink the entire aviation industry because we are pushed to have these weekends away, fly off, and it's cheap. It's technically should be working on time. It's like it's a good service. And I know it's a bit hypocritical to say, because someone like me has enjoyed the service for a while now, but it's really not sustainable in any way, shape, or form. There is a continuous building of more airports, of enlarging fleets. And sadly, we don't need that. I think we should make flying a bit more expensive and it becomes a treat instead of doing it every other weekend.
Well, I'm not going to get into the debate about keeping flying for the rich or elitism or any of that kind of stuff. But I do think it's a concern when flying to a city within a country is cheaper than taking a train.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, the UK is a master example of this. Sometimes it's more expensive to go from London to Manchester on the train than from London to Spain with the flight.
Yeah.
And yeah, of course, I don't want to keep flights as an elitist thing. But sometimes, like, I've paid flights 20 euros. Why? Like, why is the train to the airport costing me more than flying? Like, it shouldn't work like that. But I know this is a whole can of worms. I know, I promised we would keep
This is the can of worms of economics that I'm desperate to get into, but I'm not sure we've got time to do it today.
We need to do a special for the EU carbon removals and a special for I mean, of course, there's so many specials to do. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. And it's now time to get to our interview of the week. I'm joined today by Callum Laing, founder of the Veblen Director Program, author of A Boardroom Blueprint, founder and former CEO of the MBH Corporation, and just a general boardroom expert. Thank you so much for joining us today.
That's a pleasure. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So today we're going to focus on the importance of taking sustainability strategies to the top level by involving the boards of companies. So I think to start, my first question is, do you think that boards have a solid knowledge base when it comes to sustainability issues?
No. No, and look, I think to be fair to boards, they haven't been measured on that. Up until now, like it's not been the thing that we kind of need to remember about boards is that they live or die by the investors, especially when you get into the world of public companies. And for the past 100 years, the mantra has always been that the board is there for shareholder profits. So the reason that they exist and what they're trying to do with the companies is to focus on shareholder profits. And it's only in a relatively recent times that sort of at that top level, and primarily driven by investors, there's been a change in the conversation to say, okay, actually our responsibility is all stakeholders. And that includes team, that includes communities, that includes the environment. But things are slow to change. And so when I wrote the book Boardroom Blueprint, it was really saying, look, we need to get diversity onto boards. And we've got a unique opportunity now where there is this pressure from investors to think differently. And therefore that needs different people. And up for the last 100 years, it's been a very exclusive club made up primarily of people that went to the same schools, same universities, same career paths, and all look the same. So that was kind of where we came at it from. And I think what's interesting is if you look at small businesses have actually been thinking about sustainability for a long time. Small businesses do it because they are in tune with their clients and they're in tune with their staff. If you want to attract the best staff now, you have to have a bigger purpose than just making money. And I think my approach has been, if that's where we're seeing the change happening, let's just do more of that. Let's make it easier for small businesses to bring on board the right people onto their boards and then grow up with that, rather than, I think, sort of governments have tended to focus on this top-down legislation. And with that only works with the biggest companies, and I'm not entirely convinced it actually works anyway. So yeah, overall, I'd say boards still have quite a lot to learn on this topic.
Yeah. So, excuse my ignorance. When it comes to a board, would companies select the board members based on, would each board member have a role? So, for example, when it comes to sustainability, would the company of the future appoint a board member specifically to advise on that topic?
So I think the long-term goal for anyone in this space is not that you have a sustainability person or a diversity person. It's that it becomes so common and so obvious that everyone needs to be thinking about it. Like you just wouldn't be having. So the board is there to keep the company on track and to look at the long-term strategy and hire and fire the CEO. The aim is, if the board is doing a good job and is focused in this area, then every decision they make goes through a decision tree, which includes, is this in the best interests of all stakeholders of a wider community? Now that's not happening now. So what you're seeing already is you have ESG subcommittees, which are focused on things like sustainability and diversity. But they are kind of this bolt-on, and they're not really, I don't think they're sort of fully integrated into the process yet. But that's the aim, is that, all decision makers are thinking in terms of long-term sustainability. And I think it's not going to happen overnight. Like if you look at kind of the business world, everything, for as long as we can remember, has always been predicated on growth, and it's very short term. So if you look at Silicon Valley, which does amazing PR, if nothing else, but their focus is always like start a startup, get to 1 billion users, and then exit. And so it's always just scale. If you look at Wall Street and the London Stock Exchange, capital markets, everything's focused on 90 days. It's what's happening this quarter, what's happening next quarter. There is no reward for founders or CEOs who talk about 100-year vision. There is no, that used to be the way back in, sort of 100 plus years ago. There was this idea of legacy, and it carried weight. And so if you put your name on a company and that company survived for 100 years, that was a great mark of good intention and success. Today, it's not really, nobody cares about it. And because I think people have a short-term focus, and unfortunately that's carried into the business world. So that's kind of where we are today.
So we really need a shift in mindset before we even think about a shift in the boardroom, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's why I think, and look, I think the consumers have sort of started to get that this has shifted over the last 20, 30, 40 years. I mean, I grew up in the UK, and as a young entrepreneur, you had people like Anita Roddick from Body Shop. That was the first kind of environmentally friendly business that really yelled about its credentials from the top, and that attracted like-minded people that wanted to go and work with them. And at the time, she was very unique. Now, this idea of businesses with a stronger why and a stronger purpose and is pretty well accepted, and customers given the choice, will go to companies that stand for something more. And employees definitely will favor companies that are standing for something better. And I think bigger companies haven't had to adapt. Smaller companies have had to adapt because that's the only way they could attract them, which is good. And I think that will continue to move up the ladder. And I think boards will continue to say, okay, well, in order for us to be successful, we do need to be attracting different ways of thinking, and ultimately we'll get there. But it is a slow process.
So when it comes to companies that do have a sustainability strategy in place, are they usually being developed by the top management team and taken to the board for approval, or does it never really reach that top level?
It depends on the company and whether it's. So there's a lot of talk about ESG as a whole, so which is a horrible mishmash of throwing in governance and sustainability and environment, which doesn't really work anyway. But it was an attempt to try and get companies to do the right thing. And I think what you're seeing is it's not going to go away. That the mood has shifted, and after the global financial crisis, investors lost trillions of dollars and said, all right, we need a shift in thinking. We need companies that have diversity of thought and are willing to question the status quo and do different things. At the same time, you've got governments that are now applying top-down regulation. So all these companies have to do ESG reporting. The problem is, I don't think the mindset of most companies is there yet. And so I think when you talk about sustainability and your ESG, a lot of it is kind of like a box ticking exercise. We feel like we have to do this, or you kind of get into this greenwashing thing where we say the right thing. I am one of the organizers of Pride 365. Gets very frustrated because one day a year, all these companies wave a rainbow flag and say, yeah, we're all for this. And then the rest of the year they do nothing. And I think you kind of have that with, it was saying sustainability and diversity, and like there's kind of nice PR, but not a lot of change behind the scenes. But I think you kind of have to start there. Like, I think that's already a massive improvement on just denying that was an important thing. And so I think now they're acknowledging it's an important thing. I think our job, or what I'm trying to do, is to make it easy for boards to learn this from the inside. And so like the premise of Boardroom Blueprint was these boards are under immense pressure. They've got shareholders that demand returns. They've got staff who want to grow. They've got all of these pressures on them, and they're terrified of doing the wrong thing. And so oftentimes they do nothing, especially when it's kind of new and they don't really understand it. And so what I talk about in the book is how do we de-risk this? So if you're somebody that knows a lot about sustainability, you could be a potentially great hire for a company that wants to, they know that they need to make this shift, but they don't know how to do it. To them, hiring you as a board member would be a huge risk because they don't know whether you're going to fit with the culture. They don't know whether you've got that board experience. And so what we do is we set up things like advisory boards or apprentice boards where you could go in, sit as an apprentice board member for a year. You can help them with the ESG reporting, which, believe me, they don't want to do themselves. So the idea of you doing it for them would be fantastic. And it gives you that much needed experience and insight so that now other boards are clamoring after you, and you can kind of get into the inside. And that's, we sort of talk about it like a Trojan horse. It's not something you can fight from the outside. You really need to be on the inside, but to be on the inside, they need to trust you. And so you have to build a relationship with them over time. So that's kind of the focus that we've had with Boardroom Blueprint.
I think this is really interesting. And when it comes to sustainability, so much of it is new. And so I can see the point of companies being nervous about hiring people on their boards because maybe they have limited experience, because everyone has limited experience, right? And I think my initial view of a boardroom is of people that have had really long careers, decades to show for. But when it comes to sustainability, I suppose that you could hire a board member that has been in the job market for, I don't know, 10 years or even less,
Yeah, for
right?
sure. And look, I think this is where things are starting to change, and it hasn't been in the board's interest for the past 100 years to like that. It's been in their interests to promote this idea that they are incredibly smart and they've got decades of experience and they're very clever and that they know the strategy and everything else. Actually, when you get into boards, you discover it that not always quite as smart as they would like you to think. And of course, there's the lack of diversity. Like if everyone comes through the same schools, same colleges, same Boston Consulting Group, everyone ends up thinking the same way. So you don't get genuine discourse and you don't get genuine decisions that are made for the best of the company. And so what's happening now, and again, you can't just apply for a board seat and hope that they will think diversity is good, because if they hire you and this is your first board seat and you turn out to be rubbish at the job, or worse, you turn out to be disruptive on the board, it's not like hiring a customer service agent where like there's high turnover and you just get rid of them after a week. If you hire a board member and it's a bad hire, you either have to fire them, which is the market hates because it makes the entire board look incompetent, or you have to put up with them, and the average tenure is 9 years. So that's a long time to put up with a bad hire. And so this is why even boards that acknowledge that diversity and ESG are good, they don't want to hire anyone because they're terrified of making the wrong decision, which is why we go in and we say, look, what about we build an apprentice board for you? We'll bring in a sustainability expert. We'll bring in somebody from a region that, like the Middle East, where you might be thinking about expanding to, or Africa. Or so we put together this very diverse apprentice board. And what that does is, that gives the board a chance to build trust with people that they wouldn't normally get to interact with. It doesn't cost them anything. You don't get a vote. You don't get paid for being an apprentice. You do all the work that they don't want to do, like ESG reporting. But you're getting incredible experience. You're getting a chance to build these amazing relationships. And very quickly, you become the most valuable people in that room because you know the stuff that actually is what investors are now demanding. And so that makes you very valuable. And then it becomes very easy to say, look, I've worked with you for a year. You've done a fantastic job for us. Our expectation was down here. You've delivered up here. We'd love to bring you in to the board because now you've de-risked it for them. And I think that's the bit for, there's so much good stuff in sustainability, but we have to make it commercially relevant to businesses. Otherwise, it's not going to, like, it just gets dismissed as another nice to have. And so we have to find these hacks or these ways of making businesses see that it's in their interests to do this. I think that's the nature of capitalism, for right or for wrong.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And do you find that there is demand for these apprentice boards?
So there's no demand for apprentice boards. What there's demand for is the results that the apprentice boards can give. So what we point out is, since the global financial crisis, $20 trillion has been raised into ESG funds. So environmental society governance got very trendy for a while. Everyone went out and raised money and said, right, we're only going to invest in good companies that are doing good things. And one of the core components of that is that you can't invest into a company that doesn't have a diverse board. And then we go back to this issue of, even those companies that want to have diverse boards, nobody wants to take the risk. And so you've got trillions of dollars of dry capital, and then you've got these companies that genuinely, they're desperate for the money to grow. They meet all the other criteria, except it's 5 white men sat on the board. And so if we can put together an apprentice program underneath, they can now go out to the investor community and say, hey, look how forward thinking we are. We're being very progressive. We're taking the right steps. And that again enables them to get access to that capital, which is what they really need and want.
But then eventually they do need to hire someone from the advisory board. Otherwise, it will stay the same board of white men.
No, for sure. But I think there's a huge difference between hiring someone you've spent a year in board meetings with, who has delivered, who has shown that they're trustworthy, who understands the culture of the company, who understands. So I also understand even like the power dynamics that go on in a board. Like, remember, these generally men are under an enormous amount of scrutiny, talking about huge amounts of money. There's a lot of internal politics going on. So if you were hired on day one, and you get paid a lot to sit on a board, so you get hired on day one, you go in and you try and solve all the problems, you end up annoying everyone because like you don't understand the culture, you don't understand the dynamics. Whereas if you sit as an apprentice for a year, you get to say, okay, look, that's the chairperson, but this is the person that actually I need to build the relationship with, and this is how it works. And but they also get to see you've put together an ESG report for them. They've been able to talk to investors because of what you've done. Those investors want you in the room because you're the only person that knows the topic well. It just kind of makes it easy for them and easy for you, rather than sort of this combative approach, which I think is often what we end up with.
Yeah. And so if I am a startup founder, for example, and I want to set up a board and keep sustainability in mind, what's your advice?
So I'm a huge proponent that all startups should have advisory boards. I think it's so there's 330 million companies in the world. Less than 1% of them have an active board, yet every single successful company has a board. That kind of suggests that boards might be quite a useful thing to have. Now, when you're a startup, obviously you haven't got any resources. You don't need to go out and pay someone. What you can do is say, look, this is an advisory board. It's very informal. We're going to meet for coffee once a month. I'm bringing in someone from marketing. I'm bringing in someone from sustainability. I'm bringing in someone from Eastern Europe, like the areas where we want to grow. And you keep it very informal. You say, look, if we're successful in the future, maybe I can give you some equity or some cash if you want to stay on the board. But you keep it very informal. And I think so I have the Veblen Director Program where we train people on how to do this, and companies come to us all the time for advisory boards. But what I encourage our members to do is go and talk to any startup, any small business, and say, hey, look, I will set up an advisory board for you. So if your background's sustainability, the more board experience, the more weight you have, the more impact you can have in the world. Like, that's just, boards are a great place to make an impact. But you kind of got to get on that ladder first. And so going and setting up an advisory board, and the nice thing about setting up an advisory board for a company is by default, so you're finding 4 or 5 other cool people that you're going to meet for coffee virtually or otherwise once a month just to talk about this company. It's only 1 or 2 hours a month, but by default, you end up on that board because you set it up. Plus, you get to hang out with 4 or 5 other cool people, and they owe you a favor now because you just got them onto an advisory board. We have actually we've got a summit. But one of our members, I was just talking to a couple of days ago, Rona. She's had 6 board offers in the last 6 months. So once a month, she's just followed this process. And now almost every month she's getting new companies coming to her, because once you're on that,
she's busy.
She is busy. Yeah. But once you're on that ladder, so it's kind of like when you very first started work, everyone said, no, I won't hire you till you've got work experience. And you go, yeah, but how do I get work experience if you won't hire me? The same thing repeats at the other end of the career ladder on the boardroom. They go, yeah, we'd love to hire you once you've got more experience. So starting with startups and early stage businesses is a great way to build that experience and build some amazing connections as well.
No, this is really fascinating, Callum. Is there anything else you would like to add?
No, look, I think, this is important stuff, and businesses need to get there. I think the important piece is trying to frame sustainability in a way that businesses understand, and trying to work with them rather than, basically try and partner on the way forward. But I personally believe that boards are a great way of doing that. But rather than focus on the boards of Microsoft and SO and those guys, which are nearly impossible to reach, there's millions of small companies that actually you can have an impact and leverage that to build into bigger companies and slowly work your way up. So yeah, that would be my message.
Amazing. Well, we're going to leave the links to your contacts and for the Veblen program as well in the show notes. And for our listeners, thank you so much for following this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to our social media and newsletter, and see you next week.